So the title of this episode, of course, is Did Biden Just Buy the Midterms? Now, what could we possibly be referring to by that? Did he, spend a whole bunch of money doing on extra campaign apparatuses, more ads in favor of Democrats? No. Biden may have just bought the 2022 midterms for himself and for the Democratic Party by buying the votes of the American people, by buying millions and tens of millions of votes through one of the biggest, most generous handouts his government has ever provided. One of the biggest handouts, I think, in recent memory from any administration. Jacob, why don't you tell us a little bit, give us some of the 411, the key details we need to know about Biden's $300 billion student loan forgiveness handout.
Yeah, so this plan is a lot more insidious than I think Republicans realize. Republicans, they're going apoplectic about this. It's funny, after this was announced, I checked out Fox News just to see their meltdown. Mm-hmm. And I think it was like the top 7 out of 10 articles on the front page were talking about this. Went to Breitbart saying like top 7 out of 10. Go to every conservative news outlet. They were just completely going berserk over this. Which interestingly enough, I don't think former President Trump has actually made a single statement about this. He's just completely ignored this entirely, which props to him. I mean, because
he wanted to. When he was president, when they were talking about what provisions would go into the first few COVID stimulus bills during the pandemic, he wanted to include cancellation of student debt. Even he understood that's
correct.
Exactly. But of course, Republicans in Congress, like his infrastructure bill, they shut that down because government spending bad. But even Trump, again, trying to shift the paradigm, to shift the Republican Party to a more nationalist America First party, which that is very much an America First stance, is looking out for citizens who are crushed by this unfair, undue financial burden and can't get out of it. Trump understood that, but once again, the Republican Party lagged very far behind the learning curve on that.
And I think a lot of Republicans, it still doesn't click for them. Why did Donald Trump win? And why did Mitt Romney lose? And why did Donald Trump win?
Yes.
It wasn't because of Obama. It wasn't because of Hillary Clinton. It was because of the different Republican candidates. Just to go over briefly what this executive order is going to do, it's going to provide loan forgiveness up to $10,000 for every single student who has accumulated federal student loans and makes less than $125,000 a year. It will cover up to $10,000 for people who make up to $250,000 a year if they are married, which is huge because I'm all for the government subsidizing marriage. That's a fantastic deal in my opinion. Another thing it does is it provides an additional $10,000 in student loan forgiveness per student to anyone who took out the Pell Grant. So people who took out the Pell Grant and student loans, they can have up to $20,000 of their student loan debt forgiven. And this is big because there are currently about 47 million people, American citizens, who have taken out student loans, about 45 to 47 million. Now that's 45 to 47 million people who are eligible to vote, mind you.
Yes.
More than half, more than 50% of that number has less than $20,000 in student loans left to pay off. What this means is if this is held up constitutionally, of course, this will be challenged in court, but if it holds up, Joe Biden is going to wipe out the debt of more than half of America's current student loan holders. That's 20 million voters. 20
million American voters. And of course, not all of them are Republicans and independents who are now going to flip Democrat. Obviously, you can guess that quite a few of them probably already were Democrats. But the fact of the matter is that, especially because these are mostly younger people, right, Jacob? These are mostly the millennials and maybe the youngest of Gen Xers at this point.
Yeah, the Department of Education actually provides estimates on that. So according to the DOE, 21% are 25 years old and younger. 44% are between the ages of 26 and 39. More than a third are 40 and up, and approximately 5% are senior citizens. So it's actually not a lot of younger voters. These are actually a lot of people who are in their 30s. I mean, people in their 30s are the ones who have the most debt, and they make up the largest cohort of student people who have student debt. But a lot of them are in their 40s. A lot of these people are established adults who are middle age, and many of them have probably never voted in their life.
Exactly.
Or they only vote every other 8 years.
And so I was just going to say, so certainly they're the oldest of millennials and the youngest of Gen Xers. But the important thing is, even among the millennials, the ones you said, the 21% who are 25 years and under, the thing about those voters is that those are fresh out of college students who more than likely support Bernie Sanders and AOC types. And those are the voters who, up to this point, were saying, oh, Biden's not doing enough. He's not doing enough on racial justice. He's not doing enough on global warming. He's not doing enough on student debt. He's not doing anything. These voters were prepared to stay home in November because they thought Biden wasn't governing as enough of a progressive. Well, now he just forgave their student loan debt, which means they are now that much more incentivized. If they have never voted before, like you said, some of the older ones, or if they were not going to vote, they now have a good reason to get out in November and vote for Democrats to reward Joe Biden for what he just did.
And motivating your base, the people who are most likely to vote for your party, is more important than winning over independents, especially in a country as polarized as the United States. And this is why issues like abortion are so key. When you're in a district that has less than 130,000 people who are going to show up to vote, as in New York's District 19, getting that extra 10,000 voters out of 130,000 who care vehemently about abortion to show up and vote can mean the difference between winning 51% to 49% or losing 55 to 45. So in a swing, like a lot of these swing districts, getting that extra little bump, getting those extra million, even if it's just an extra million voters that Democrats win because of this issue, is going to go a long way in stopping the red wave in November. So from a political standpoint, this is genius. This is absolutely genius because you're not forgiving the student loans of people who are wealthy. And this is one of the major criticisms of this. And we'll go over the criticisms more in depth here in a second. But this is one of the major criticisms that actually holds water because nobody wants wealth to be transferred from the poor to the wealthy. Throughout human history, that's just toxic. You can't run on that. So nobody wants to see people who are wealthy having their student loans forgiven, and this doesn't do that. One of the main criticisms of this would be that there's no phase-in, phase-out period. So it's like if you make $126,000, you don't get anything forgiven, but if you make $124,000, you get up to $10,000, potentially $20,000 if you took out a Pell Grant. So that's it's not, this deal isn't perfect. Obviously, there's a lot of problems with this, but that's one thing that's good about this is it doesn't forgive the loans of people who are uber wealthy. Another thing about this is what a lot of people don't understand is that the reason why Americans aren't having children to a large extent is because the people who would normally be the middle class home builders who would get married in their 20s, who would have children, who would have 3 or 4 or 5 children, who would buy a house with a nice big backyard and live the American dream, their growth, their personal growth is completely stymied by the fact that they've got this ball and chain hanging around them that's called student loan debt. And if this is taken out of the way and this debt is completely forgiven, it's going to allow people to move out and take jobs in their field. Because as it currently stands, this is what ends up happening. This is kind of how the so-called American dream has worked over the past 30 years. You have someone who's from a lower income household and they want to go to college so they can achieve the American dream. So they end up taking $30,000 to $50,000 in student loans to go to college. They get a degree, they get out, and typically if you have a degree, especially the liberal arts, you're going to need at least 2 years to find a career path job, at least 2 years.
Yeah.
And during that time, you're probably going to have to take some unpaid internships. You might have to take some very low paid minimum wage internships. But what you don't want to do is take something that's going to put food on the table. If you take a job just to put food on the table, you're going to end up setting yourself back 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And some people, they never go and use their degree. This is why you have so many people with degrees that are working in industries that they didn't need a degree in. And the person who grew up in an era before student loans, they look at that, they say, wow, our education system is wasteful. Our loan system is wasteful, which it is, but they look at that as proof that we're wasteful, when in reality, the reason why that person isn't using their degree is because they didn't have an extra 2 years after they graduated college to find a job with their degree, because they had to start making money now. And just to run through, a lot of people already know this, but just to run through the different types of loans, you have federal subsidized loans, which allows you, the government pays the interest on those loans until 6 months after you graduate. You have federal unsubsidized loans, which the government does not pay interest on. In other words, it's accumulating interest while you're in school. And then, of course, you have the PLUS loans, which are loans given to parents of graduate students. And those are some of the most damaging because then the parents have to pay those back. And a lot of times the kids end up having to take out private loans to help their parents when they get older. It's just, the whole thing is a mess. But after 6 months after they graduate, their loans start accumulating interest. So they have to get a job to start making those monthly payments if they don't want their credit rating to be destroyed. So they'll go take a job waiting tables. They'll go take a job. Sometimes they'll work a night job waiting tables, and they'll try to work an internship during the day. And because they're so exhausted during the day, because they're working nights waiting tables, they do their job poorly, they get fired, and that sets them back in their career. Or they just decide, you know what, I have to make money now, so I'm just going to delay trying to start my career. And they don't start their career until they're in their 30s, and now they're competing against people who are younger than them, who are fresh out of college. So the point is, the reason why you have so many people not using their degree, who wasted that degree, wasted all that money, is because they didn't have that extra time after they graduated to be able to start their career, whereas had they graduated debt-free, they would have. Another problem that student loans present is the fact that it encourages people to go to college who have no business going to college. And this is what I've had several conversations with people about this over the past few days. And one thing that people don't seem to understand is that this is not like a car loan. This is not like a mortgage. In order to get a car loan, you have to have a credit check. In order to get a mortgage, you have to have a credit check. You don't have to have any credit to get these loans. These are federal loans who are backed by the Department of Education. They're paid out of the U.S. Treasury. All you have to do is be living in the U.S. legally and be breathing. And if you're breathing and if you're living in the U.S. legally, you are eligible for these loans. So when people argue that, okay, well, why doesn't the government wipe out my mortgage payment? Why doesn't the government pay for my car loan? Well, you qualified for that because you had a credit score. These 18-year-olds don't have a credit score, and they qualified for these loans by simply being in the U.S.
This is why it's important to have this discussion, to get down to the nitty-gritty of why this is so important, and most importantly, to help further debunk the honestly really cringe counter-arguments you're hearing from the GOP about this. So, of course, in response, the GOP, like you said, Fox News, conservative media, all of them, certain politicians, they're all up in arms. Of course, they're doing exactly what we all thought they would do. They're reacting to this by screeching about more socialism. Hard-working taxpayer dollars are just paying to bail out lazy socialist college kids. I mean, first off, and I think we talked about this before, Jacob, how is this any different from our tax dollars paying for any form of government spending, whether it's Social Security, whether it's Medicare, whether it's the military budget? Anything the government spends money on is using taxpayer dollars. That's where the government gets its revenue from.
And before people object that they paid into Medicare and Social Security, I would simply remind them that they are eligible for a lot more money in Medicare than they paid into it. And they are eligible for a lot more money in Social Security, because Social Security isn't going to stop their payments once Social Security has paid out to them everything that they paid in.
Exactly. And also, of course, you got another very recent example in President Trump's two COVID stimulus bills. Those checks, those like $2,000 checks that he gave to like every American to keep them afloat during COVID. That was a form of government spending. And of course, that rightfully so was praised across the board politically as a good move. Republicans liked it because it was something President Trump did. But of course, now Biden tries to do something similar. They're like, oh no, this is socialism. So it's just playing cheap party politics. When again, the reality is that President Trump acknowledged how important this was, how politically smart this was. The rest of Republicans have not caught on yet. And of course, it goes without saying, the most socialism argument does not mean a single thing to those who were most directly affected by this. Again, the Zoomers, the Millennials, the Gen Xers, the youngest of the Gen X, who just had their debt wiped out. After all, these voters already mostly support people like Bernie and AOC for a reason. They like stuff like this. But the fact of the matter is that historical circumstances can indebt an entire generation of voters to a political party. Obviously,
yes, that's correct.
You had the Civil Rights Act and the various other bills, the Voting Rights Act passed in the mid-'60s by Lyndon Johnson, who, of course, he knew what he was doing. He infamously said behind the scenes, as he was getting ready to walk out and sign the legislation, he said, I'll have those N-words voting Democratic for the next 200 years. And sure enough, he turned out to be right. So even as these voters were on the verge of maturity and realizing, yeah, voting for liberals is kind of dumb at this point, they're irresponsible, they're just going to make things worse, they just bought off this generation, millennials especially, to stay in their pocket for another 20 to 30 years, especially when you consider, obviously, the greatest generation, sadly, is all but gone. Boomers are getting older and are slowly on their way out. Gen X is kind of a smaller generation that's like sandwiched between boomers and millennials. So when it happens in 2 or 3 more decades and boomers are almost mostly gone, you're going to have a lot of millennials in this country. The dominant age group in this country will be millennials, who 20 to 30 years from now, when boomers are gone and millennials are the top dog age demographics-wise, they're going to remember this. They're still going to be indebted to Democrats for bailing them out when they were in their 20s and 30s and allowing them to have a job and to have a family and raise a family and get the mortgage, get that car loan, et cetera, et cetera. And they are not going to forget that.
Because like those statistics that I just read, all 5% of student loan holders are senior citizens.
Yes.
You got over 20%, about a third of student loan holders are over the age of 40. So a millennial who's 35 years old today, if he gets his debt wiped out, he's not going to be 40 years old and still have student loan debt. He's not going to be in his 50s and still making student loan payments. And another thing that I want to point out about this, a lot of people, they're looking at the debt forgiveness plan, but Biden actually has a plan to make debt forgiveness permanent, because people will say, well, if this is what's going to happen, then what people are going to do, more people are going to go to college because they figure, well, the government will just cover it for me. Well, he's actually got a plan, and we'll link to in the description, to where it lowers people's monthly payment, and it makes it to where if they make payments on time for 10 years, they can have all of their debt forgiven. And another thing that's really politically ingenious is he makes it to where if you work for a nonprofit, you get your student loan debts forgiven, which means
Wow.
people who go work for the Open Society foundations, they get their student loan debts forgiven.
Oh.
This is rewarding Democratic voters. It's rewarding Democratic activists, people who go work for neoliberal nonprofits who support the deep state and want to keep the status quo. They be from a very poor background, often a minority background. They can take out $40,000-$50,000 in student loan debt to get that master's degree, so they can go get that good cushy job in D.C. And guess what? Because they're working for a nonprofit that is actually an undercover political activist organization, then they get all of their debt wiped free. Hey, this is props to Biden. Like, this is an ingenious way to ensure that his party is going to maintain a lock iron grip on American politics for decades to come. And this is why the Democratic Party has won the popular vote. What is it? I think it's 7 out of the past 8 elections.
Yeah, every election since 1988, with the sole exception of 2004, Bush v. Kerry.
Yes, that's the reason why the Democratic Party continues to beat the Republican Party like a drum, because they understand human nature better than Republicans do. And look, the argument that Republicans are making about this is basically the counter argument. Okay, you took out loans, buddy, you pay them back.
Yep.
Okay, well, how are you going to win elections if that's your attitude? It sounds good, and you might get a lot of people who are older, who worked hard, who didn't go to college and build a business off of their own sweat and hard work and ingenuity. You might get them to vote for you, but they make up like 2% of the population. How are you going to win over voters if you take that attitude? It's a numbers game. It's about winning elections. It's about getting 50.1% of the population to show up and vote for you. And they're not going to do that if you're basically telling them to go take a hike. Mm-hmm. And another thing is, when you're dealing with Republicans' response to this, is obviously their attitude is you took out loans, pay it back. But they don't really have a policy when it comes to college. Have you ever heard a Republican present any kind of policy solutions to the way our university system is set up?
No, I haven't. None whatsoever.
I hear the Republicans present a lot of policies on taxes, on how to reform the tax code. I heard a lot from Paul Ryan on that in the Tea Party.
Government regulations, government spending, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, they'll come up with ways to tweak government regulations. A lot of them are really in-depth, ingenious ways to actually make the country function better. But when it comes to college, most Republicans don't even talk about it. They don't have a policy. And I think a lot of it is because a lot of their constituents, most of their constituents didn't go to college, but the ones who did came from very wealthy backgrounds. And so they never had to take out student loans or never had to worry about this stuff. Their dads just paid for it all. It's like, okay, your college tuition for 4 years is $88,000. All right, buddy, I've got $5 million in the bank. $88,000 is no problem. There you go. And when that's their constituency, they don't really have to think through this stuff. And so this is why, if you're going to actually counter the left, if you actually want to win elections, you're going to have to sit down and think about this stuff. Okay, student loans. Why do we have student loans? The reason student loans in the United States started in 1958. In 1958, after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the United States believed that it was behind the Soviets in science and technology. So in order to spur people in science and technology, it started offering federal guaranteed loans for people who were going to study in science, technology, and education, but only in science, technology, and education. If you were going to get a history degree or anything else, if you weren't going to teach, you couldn't get that loan. It was a very small loan. And keep in mind, this is 1958. College is dirt cheap. The middle class can afford to go to college in 1958. In 1965, though, as part of the Great Society, we started expanding loans to try to help poor people go to college. And that's what got the ball rolling in this whole nightmare of student loans. And of course, it just completely exploded in the 90s and the early 2000s. Their kids wanted to go to college, and they believed that was the path to the middle class. And they're like, okay, we'll see what the federal government is offering in loans. Oh, the federal government's going to pay for it all? Absolutely, just go ahead and take it out. And this ties back into the argument that these 18-year-olds are being irresponsible. The average 18-year-old doesn't know what a loan is. The average 18-year-old has a very vague notion of what interest payments are. All the average 18-year-old knows is that his parents, Hollywood, his teachers, everybody
fellow
who has
students.
his fellow students, everyone who has any authority in his life has been urging him to go to college ever since he was very little, because that's the path forward. All he knows is that his sports teams are college teams. So the dream of sitting in the student section, having beer poured on your head while you cheer on the Crimson Tide. So you've got this whole culture that is culminating in college. Like college is the epitome of living in America. Those are the wonder years of your life. So you go to college. You don't think about how you're going to pay for it. Your parents don't think about how you're going to pay for it. So in that kind of culture, how are you going to hold that individual accountable for taking out subsidized federal loans when he's been told that this is the path to the middle class? I mean, if anything, make his parents pay him back, because his parents oftentimes basically told them, you are going to college. Like, you're not going to be a bum flipping burgers at McDonald's when you're 30 years old. You are definitely going to college.
Exactly. This is sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, yeah, I was just going to make one more point, and that is with young men. In any society, the way young men attract young women to procreate and start families is they need to be able to make more money than women. Mm-hmm. Even in an advanced society, this is just biological. Women are more attracted to men who make more money than they do. And so for a young man, they know that if they want to have sex in a marital relationship, if they want to actually get married and have sex, they're going to need to make good money. And they look at the statistics, and college graduates make 70% more than people who never went to college. So they go to college, even if it means going into debt.